This series of talks, Searching for Religious Self-Awareness, was recorded by St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker, Father Jim Basic, holds advanced degrees from Fordham and the Athenaeum of Ohio. He received his doctorate from the University of Oxford in England in 1978. Father Basic is presently Associate Pastor of St. Thomas More University Parish in Bowling Green, Ohio, where he is also a part-time lecturer at the university. Now, Father Basic.
I would like to explore together the general topic of religious self-awareness. By religious self-awareness, I refer to the fact of our great effort to understand who we are, to explore ourselves in greater depth. Perhaps it's important to explain that term a bit, religious self-awareness. When I'm talking about the self, I'm talking about all that we are as human beings. I'm really not interested in entering into the debate with the Buddhists whether a self really exists or not. I'm simply talking about us, our experience, our general experience of who we are as human beings. It's important to remember, I think, at the beginning that this self that we are is a related self, that we're not just private individuals. We're not islands unto ourselves. We don't just live in our own narrow world. We are immediately related selves. That is, we're immediately involved with other people. We grow to know who we are through our interaction with other people. Our identity really is sociological in a sense. People give us feedback as to who we are, and that's what helps us to reach this deeper understanding. It's also important to realize that the self is not a static reality. I'm never completed. Really, the process of life is to make myself to be what I will be forever. The self is a dynamic and evolving reality. I remember the line from Hubert Humphrey when he was asked a little boy, says, "Who are you?" And he says, "Well, I don't know because I'm not finished yet." And that represents sort of the idea here. Who are we? Well, we're not really sure because we're not finished yet. We're in process all through our lives of creating ourselves and making ourselves to be what we will be forever. So the self is a dynamic and involved and relational kind of reality. We're the kind of people who are immersed in a world, thrown into existence, having to interact with other people. Now let's talk a bit about that word awareness in this title, religious self-awareness. The word awareness perhaps can be best dealt with by thinking of our own experience. Our experience, again, is not this something that we simply have. Experience, especially in the American pragmatic tradition, is really the whole communicative network in which we find ourselves immersed. Experience involves two poles, the subjective pole, me, and that objective world out there that I'm interacting with. So that experience, again, is this booming, buzzing reality, as it was called, that I find myself immersed in. Now, as I begin to deal with that experience, I find that some parts of it are very vague to me. Some parts lie sort of on the edge of my consciousness. It is more like a vague sort of mood or feeling that I really have trouble making explicit or putting into words. On the other hand, some parts of my experience I can verbalize easily. I can talk to other people about it. I can symbolize it. It's all very clear to me. I would be able to explain it to some other people. So what we find when we begin to look at our self-experience is that there are degrees of consciousness of that experience. Some very vague, some just lying on the edge of my consciousness that I really can't put into words at all. It's almost pre-conscious or unconscious kind of material. On the other hand, at the other limit, I have very clear ideas about who I am and what I'm going through. I would be able to tell somebody clearly about it. Now, in between, we find gradations of that. There are various levels of my ability to be in touch with this booming, buzzing world that I'm involved in, this experience that's often so dense and difficult to get a hold of. So, my awareness, therefore, changes or can grow. Part of the process, therefore, that I'm talking about here is to be able to move to a greater awareness of all of this. That is, to take this material that is sort of pre-conscious or unconscious, that is roaming around on the edge of my consciousness, and to bring it into a clearer awareness. That's what I'm trying to do through this whole business of improving my religious self-awareness. Now, this word religious, need to talk a little bit about that as well. So the word religious reminds us that who we are as human beings is not exhausted by empirical studies. I'm more than you can put on a computer card. I'm more than you can quantify or weigh or experimentally somehow check out. There are deeper dimensions of my reality that sort of transcend this hard data. As well, when I'm talking about religious, I'm also sort of playing that off against simply a psychological orientation. A lot of efforts at self-awareness involve psychological methods of just trying to search the deepest parts of myself for explanations of what is going on. It's the common therapeutic thing that goes on in our society. It's an attempt to make causal relationships between perhaps what went on in my childhood and what I'm going through now. And really, I am trying to ask even deeper questions than that. So I'm trying to ask about meaning and purpose and values. I'm trying to figure out what are the sources of my deepest joys in life, the triumphs that I enjoy, as well as the deepest sources of the sorrow and difficulties that I go through. And so the word religious is meant to get us in touch with the mysterious depths of reality in which we're always immersed. We find ourselves sort of poised over an abyss that's always beyond our comprehension, oriented to a mystery that we can never get a hold of. So the word religious points to that kind of experience, and it really invites us to explore that experience without excluding anything that's authentically human. The beautiful thing about a religious search is that nothing is ruled out. We don't narrow ourselves just on what is measurable, and we don't limit ourselves just to causal explanations of what is going on, but we allow this deeper world and this greater world to impinge upon us. So it is really a matter of asking what we would call the great human questions and trying to learn to articulate them better. It's a matter of trying to be in touch with the deepest experiences of our lives. It's not simply a matter at all of what the church might say, although that might be an important element in it. It is a broad-ranging kind of search. I use the word religious much as Paul Tillich used it, as the depth dimension of the whole of reality. So, we're involved here in what I call a search for religious self-awareness, a self that's always interdependent, involved with other people. We're dealing with experience that is sometimes on the edge of consciousness and is not clear to us, and what we're trying to do is to get a better hold on it, to understand it better, to see what makes me tick, to see where I fit into the larger scheme of things. So that's what I'm trying to do in this search for religious self-awareness. Now, it's always helpful in doing this to have some models of what is going on. In fact, as we would begin to search the great questions, it would always be helpful to have some individuals who would sort of guide us in the search. And in this first part, when I'm dealing with the methodology or the question of how I might achieve this greater self-awareness, looking for the specific methods that will help me do this, I would like to find some guidance in the great Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. Jung was born in 1875 and died in 1961, so we're roughly dealing with a 20th century figure. And Jung, near the end of his life, when he was 83 years old, decided to write an autobiography, and he recorded his own journey in life in a great, wonderful book by the name of Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, his spiritual autobiography. And in that book, he doesn't concentrate so much on the external events in his life, but the internal journey. It really is a spiritual and religious quest that he is involved in. Writing things down for him in his life was extremely important. He once said that when he didn't do that, he felt physical pain. He felt a need to probe that world and to articulate it and to get it written down in some way. Sort of reminds us of the modern journalism or journalist techniques where people are encouraged to write down their reflections. One of the important things about Carl Jung was that he was in touch with the mythic and dream side of his life. He found a lot of encouragement in examining those dreams. And one of the most important events occurred to him when he was 12 years old. He had this dream that had, the images were that God was sitting on a throne and he was over a cathedral, a great church. But Jung could not bring himself to look at the rest of that dream. He would remember that much of it, but he was terrified to think of the rest of the dream, and he spent a good deal of time shutting that out, burying it in his unconscious, and it brought him untold anxiety. But he felt that God was calling him to look at the whole of that dream. And so he finally, on one occasion, summoned up all his courage, and he did look at the rest of that dream. And the rest of the dream was quite harsh or difficult to take. It was that God was befouling his world, that God really had defecated on his world and smashed the roof of the cathedral. And it was a terrible kind of thing to think, and a 12-year-old boy was terrified of that. But the interesting thing was that when Jung finally faced that he felt this great inner peace and release in his life, that it was all right to look at that side of life, the harsh and difficult side of human existence. And he thought that at that moment he really learned what the grace of God was all about, that there was a healing grace that was involved in looking at ourselves, especially the dark side of our psychic life, the kind that we would usually repress and push down. And he felt that he had learned something about a human experience and the relationship with God, and the fact that God calls us as individuals to be true to ourselves and even to transcend the norms of society or the usual good taste that would exist in our world. And he felt that at that time he learned so much more about what religion and God was really all about, even than his minister father ever knew, who he felt just continually mouthed the truths that the church had taught him. So this is a key event in Jung's life, and it opened him up to the psychic life. It moved him for the rest of his life to be in touch with these strange emotions that were inside of him, to try to look even at the dark side of it. So he listened to his dreams throughout the rest of his life. He was faithful to that kind of psychic journey. I think that, as we know, that Jung lived this out in his everyday life, as he was a disciple of Freud and a colleague of Freud at one time, and he felt finally that Freud really was too narrow in his understanding of human existence, that his attempt to explain everything in sexual terms was really not true. And Jung allowed himself to move in what we would call a more religious direction. Even though in his scientific writings Jung did not use religious language, when he gets around to his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, and Reflections, he feels freer to use that traditional Christian language, and even from other religious traditions as well. And so that Jung found the courage to break with Freud during his professional life, and look at life more in terms of meaning. He once made a statement that all of the people he dealt with who were over 35 or so, their problems really were questions of meaning and purpose in life. And thus he introduced what we would broadly call the religious dimension in human existence. In fact, he felt that when he paid attention to the dreams and images of other people, that he understood that the human psyche was essentially religious. So his search took him into this whole realm that I'm calling religious self-awareness, at least in this broad sense. Jung once used the image. He said there were two ways to go through life. One was sort of being dragged through life by impersonal forces that one was not in touch with. And the other way to go through life was standing up, walking on one's own 2 feet, taking charge of one's life. And that's clearly what he did throughout the whole of his life. I think another interesting thing about Jung was that he was willing to investigate religious traditions other than his own Christian background. So he looked at Eastern religions, he examined their mythology and their artistic works, and that is part of the way that he developed his whole understanding of archetypes. That is, that there were these fundamental images that existed in all human beings and that came out in our religious and artistic life, and that these fundamental archetypes were things that bound us together as human beings. So by listening to what the Oriental world had to say, Jung found the commonness in part of the whole human situation. It's interesting that late in his life, when Jung was interviewed, he was asked the question, well, do you believe in God? And this can be seen on film. I think some people may have seen it in the Long Search films about the great religious traditions. But that Jung was asked, do you believe in God? And he sat there and said, no, I don't believe in God. and then added, I know there's a God. So that for Jung, the religion was extremely experiential. He was in touch with what was going on inside of him. He believed that his dreams revealed to him a relationship with a power greater than himself. Now, I like to take Jung, therefore, as a model for this religious self-awareness. Not that Jung was an orthodox type Christian in the way that many of the rest of us are, but that his search in its honesty, its openness, its willingness to look at the dark side of life could guide us. So what we're trying to do is to allow him to give us encouragement and enlightenment and guidance in the way we would go about this search for greater religious self-awareness. Now I'd like to begin to specify that a little bit, and let's look at some specific methods that we could use or approaches to try to deepen our own religious self-awareness. The first one I'm going to borrow from the great German philosopher Martin Heidegger, again a 20th century thinker. Heidegger felt that our modern society was bound up in what he called calculative thinking, that we were too involved in the technology of the modern world, that we spent all of our time thinking about means to specific ends, that we were always calculating how are we going to achieve this, how are we going to make progress, how are we going to improve our human relationships. It was a very hard-headed and rationalistic type approach to life. And so he said, if we are so dominated by this calculative thinking, we really are not going to function completely in a completely human way. And he suggested that we needed a more meditative type of thinking, a more reflective kind of reflection in which we would be calmer and more patient with ourselves, in which we would try to let the problems roll around in our mind. It's partly the distinction that the other existentialist thinker Gabriel Marcel gave us between problem solving and wrestling with mysteries. Problems are things that can be solved, even as big a problems as getting to the moon or putting a man on the moon. That represents a specific problem, and one can think of means to get there, and technology and science enables us to do. That's a problem. But there's other things in life that are mysteries. They're bigger than problems. They are inexhaustible. They don't have clear solutions. And what Heidegger said is that we need another kind of thinking when we involve ourselves in those kinds of questions. Mysteries require reflection, meditative kind of thinking. We don't expect to solve them, but we think of ourselves as wrestling with those questions. That's one of the things that Jung did so well. He suggests that with the great questions, it's enough to have wrestled with them, to be engaged with them, to allow them to take us over. There's something outside of ourselves that calls forth our best kind of thinking, but we realize that we won't come up with a final kind of solution to it. So we need to do more of this reflective style meditation in which we spend more time in silence, letting the questions roll around in our head, in which we listen to our own hearts and what's going on there, where we're trying to enter into an honest dialogue with other people who have wrestled with these same mysterious matters in their lives and see what illumination they might give us. We can just stop and think of our ordinary life, how much of it's involved in calculative thinking. You can use other words for it, but so often in life we're just going along. We got problems to solve. We got a bank account to take care of, and we've got people we got to figure out what to do. We got to prepare our classes or do our jobs and so on. And it seems like we're so bound up in that. And what Heidegger tells us is that whole technological approach to reality really makes us less human than we ought to be. He's suggesting to us that we will be far more developed, move to a greater maturity, be more in touch with who we really are when we are more reflective, when we get into this meditative type of thinking. Let go a little bit. Don't give ourselves time. This is the business of taking time out in life and building meditation into one's general approach to life, and checking out how I've done at the end of the day through an examination of conscience and so on. So here we have a first method, or an attitude, or general approach, maybe is the way of saying it, to distinguish those two types of thinking, and then look at my own life and see where could I build in more of this meditative type of thinking as to counterbalance the calculative thinking that really dominates most of my life. Now, a second method that I might suggest is borrowed from the whole area of narrative theology these days, where people have suggested to us the value of thinking of our lives as a story. We might think of Michael Novak's book, Ascent of the Mountain, as being a very good example of this kind of approach. Novak reminds us that in our lives we really author a story. By all of the decisions we make in life and the way we respond to all of the givens in our existence, we are really authoring a story. Now, his suggestion to us is that we think of our lives as well, or of ourselves, as being readers of that story, of being able to stand back and say, well, let's look at my story now. Does it make sense or not? Is it a good story? Is it taking me in the direction that I want? In which his suggestion is that we think of trying to become better readers of our own personal story in life. Now, this would mean that we would try to bring to our own story to our consciousness, to try to understand it better, to make judgments about its quality. Is it a good story or not? Does it fit the times? Does it fit my personality or character? Is it what is needed in our world today? And also then to think of ways in which we might try to improve that story. I could say, hey, my story doesn't really make sense. It isn't coherent. There's parts of my lives that don't fit together, or I'm not making the kind of contribution to the world that I'd really like to be making. So as I step back and read my story, I sort of get a distance from it. It helps me to achieve an objectivity. I mean, there's probably ways in which we would try to do this explicitly. I mean, we could use methods, for example, of writing down 5 highlights in my personal story. Write them down, what are the main turning points in my personal story, and then begin to analyze those for patterns, see if I pick up a thread, and so I can begin to make judgments about this. Now, I think that there are great advantages, really, to approaching our quest for religious self-awareness through this idea of story. First of all, it helps us to understand and integrate our past, thus freeing us for a more creative approach to the future. In other words, when I begin to look at my story, I begin to understand what makes me tick now. I'm in the process of trying to integrate that. I can take that past and say, hey, there's parts I'm not at ease with, but I've got to bring that more into focus for myself. I know sometimes in my counseling practice, when I'm sitting there listening to people, and they say, well, let me tell you my story first. And I can tell just as they tell me the story very often, they're saying, hey, I grew up in this kind of family, I had this kind of mother and father, I had these good experiences in grade school, I was hurt in this way in high school, and so on. As we listen, as they tell that story, sometimes I can almost feel the healing process going on. They begin to see it more clearly just in the telling of the story. So there are certain advantages, I think, in that. It helps us to link up our past so that we become more open to the future, so that we can gather our forces in a way to help create a better future, to avoid some of the mistakes made in the past and to build on the positive things that went on there. This story approach also points to elements which lie beyond logic and reason, the emotional side of things, the symbolic and the mythological factors which indeed do shape our consciousness and move us to action. So it puts us in, when you're talking story, you've got the emotions in there right away. There's a feeling tone to these stories. When we just rationally calculate or try to make logical sense out of what's going on in our lives, we often miss that more what I'd call emotional and symbolic and mythological side of it. Again, I think it does enable us to make these judgments I was talking about. Is my story really true to my best insights? Is it appropriate for the times in which I live? Does it really match my potential or not? Is it a consistent kind of story? What are its strengths and weaknesses, and how can my story be improved? So, the story technique, I think, is really a helpful one to recount my story. Some people say it's very good to write one's autobiography, if just to do it briefly, or to tell one's story to a counseling kind of person, or to one's spouse, or to a friend. And to do that is often to achieve an illumination and enlightenment that usually escapes us. Now, it's possible to think of this whole story business as sort of a movement from one standpoint to the other. That's the imagery in Novak's book, Ascent of the Mountain. He thinks of our story as a business of ascending a mountain, where we gradually move ourselves to higher and higher standpoints, a different place on the mountain, a higher place on the mountain. And from that new standpoint, I see a particular horizon. A new world opens up to me. Whenever I jump ahead a ways or get to a higher point on the mountain, then I see new things. And when I get to that point, part of what I'm trying to do with my story is to integrate it and say, oh, look at this. This is new and surprising. This is exciting. Where does this fit in? This new relationship I have, this new person who's so different from all the other people I knew in my life. How do I integrate that? And we stay at that plateau level for a while and try to bring together these various things. And we begin to get more familiar with that place on the mountain. And that's when I think we have our periods when our story is consistent and integrated and we feel good about ourselves. And then what happens, of course, is some new experience comes in and begins us to think thinking in another way. Some new person comes into our life and it challenges our ordinary way of thinking of things. We meet some tragedy and we say, boy, I have to rethink now where I'm standing. Very often that will cause us to move up the mountain, to struggle to a higher standpoint where I can then encompass this new experience and go through the business of integrating my story again. So I think that's a helpful way of thinking of my story, as sort of ascending a mountain. Sometimes by careful effort, and the other part of the title of his book is The Flight of the Dove, indicating that at times we just feel life as a gift. Suddenly we move to a higher standpoint, a higher place on that mountain. And we didn't cause it, we didn't earn it in any way, we just feel it as a gift, and we find ourselves feeling a new integration. Life is at ease, I'm more peaceful with myself, my relationships are going more smoothly, I like my job. When this kind of thing happens, I think we say almost spontaneously, thank you. We're addressing the one who is at the very top of the mountain and who's alluring us and drawing us forth and saying, thank you for moving me forward in life. So my story sometimes has this gift dimension to it. It's not always just struggle, not always just personal movement up the mountain, but at times I experience it as a gift from a power outside of myself. Now let me move to a third kind of thing after we've looked at this effort to become a better reader of the story that I necessarily author. And now I'm drawing inspiration from John Donne, the marvelous religious thinker who has written books like The Way of All the Earth. John Donne is an extremely imaginative thinker. He stretches our usual way of looking at things. And he's developed this technique which he calls passing over and return to self. And he suggests to us, and puts it into practice in his various books, that what we need to do is to pass over to other people's standpoint, to try to see where they are on that mountain and look at their horizons, look at their familiar world. Try to use their categories for a while in assessing what life is all about. As Rod McEwen said, to try to crawl behind their eyes for a while. It seems like this would be part of what is increases this religious self-awareness. In a sense, it's what I tried to do with Carl Jung at the beginning. That is, let's look at what Jung did in his life. We're not going to imitate it exactly. We're not going to write a spiritual autobiography as he did. We wouldn't have the opportunities as a psychiatrist as he did. And yet, by looking at his life and trying to see it the way he did, we can find enlightenment and encouragement. We can be moved to do the same type of thing. We can be moved to a greater openness to reality as we find it. It could move us to be more in touch with the dark side of our existence, for example, when we look at the way he handled that dream when he was 12 years old. So this is part of what John Donne means by passing over. We're trying to see things from the perspective of other people. We're trying out their categories. And what stands behind all of this is the conviction, indeed, that there is a commonness about the human experience. I find this when I do counseling work, that if I'm able to put aside my own needs and really try to listen to the other person, to hear what they are saying, that my usual response is to find some commonness. I'm usually able to say, yeah, I know that problem. Maybe it took a different form and maybe it's less intense, perhaps more intense on some occasions, but what I'm able to say is, yes, I understand the commonness of the human situation. We indeed walk down the same path. We encounter the same kind of joys and the same kind of sorrows in life. And that is a very freeing thing. And when we hear other people articulate it, it often helps us to increase our own religious self-awareness as I'm talking about it. Sometimes it's helpful to pass over to the great individuals. In fact, in this whole approach that I'm adopting to religious self-awareness, that's what I'm trying to do. And each time we take up a great question and wrestle with one of these mysteries of life, I think it will be helpful for us to look at some great individual who's done that wrestling, who's passed that way, and who could illuminate and enlighten us. Now, we never stay right with that person. We never walk around in their shoes. Otherwise, we become merely a disciple. I remember when I did my own work on Karl Rahner, one of the first things Rahner said to me is, don't become a disciple. Don't just follow my ways and be critical. And I know when I wrote something about him, I said that one of the great lessons I learned is that one shouldn't be a disciple of Rahner, that one should try to do what he did. That is, try to think creatively about our current situation and our own experience in the light of the Christian message. To repeat what he did, to retrieve his ideas, but to do it in one's own way, with one's own distinct approaches. So we always return to ourself in this passing over technique, but we come back, hopefully, enriched, seeing life in a new and brighter kind of way, having a renewed perspective on what it's all about, broadened horizons. And I think very often precisely the encouragement we need to look at life in a deeper way, and to look at it even when it's difficult. That's one of the main things I would get out of Carl Jung. He was adventuresome and risky. He was able to pass over to the religious traditions of the East, not afraid that it would take away his Christian heritage, but confident that it would enrich it. He was able to listen to his patients, even the most difficult people, and to spend long periods of time with them because he was convinced that there was a commonness here, that if he could find a key, he could help them to individuate themselves and grow to the kind of maturity that he wanted for people. So I think that I would try to draw that lesson from Jung, to look at even at the dark side of ourselves, even the things we don't like to look at, because very often those are the things that are suppressed, set aside, and keep us from integrating ourselves. Big part of it is to be able to look at my angers, my jealousies, my sexual drive that may be difficult to control. These are the areas that Jung and passing over to him, I think, would help us with. So I'm drawing this lesson from John Donne, this movement from our own standpoint over to another's, passing over to another and returning to myself. We can do this in ordinary conversation. This isn't just a matter of reading books. I can do that in talking to people. I can try to hear what they're saying, try to see the distinctive light they have to throw on our human reality. We can do this in every day. Married people can do this. Teachers can do that with students. We can do it even in casual conversation where we try to hear what others are saying and mine the riches of their own kind of experience. So pass over to others and return to self as sort of a general method in life which will increase our religious self-awareness. Now, a fourth method that I think we could keep in mind in trying to achieve this religious self-awareness is to make general use of the insights of the various disciplines that are available to us, like sociology, psychology, and philosophy. I think very often in the past we've had this idea that we had to draw only on the insights of theology. There's some religious people who think that these great questions are treated only by their own religious tradition. They end up wanting to know only the narrow views, perhaps, of the religious tradition in which they grew up. And I think there's a very narrowing sense about all of that. And I would rather adopt another kind of position that would say that really God's grace is available in the whole world, and people in various traditions have gotten in touch with that grace and articulated it well and found ways of verbalizing truths about the divine human relationship. Therefore, I would begin with the expectation that the philosophers and the psychologists and the sociologists, just for example, would have something important to say to us about who we are and help us to deepen this process. I suppose many people have gotten in touch with this through the humanistic wing of the modern psychological movement, people like Carl Rogers or Abraham Maslow or Gordon Allport. Viktor Frankl. These people have really probed the human situation in a very deep way. It's not simply that they've confined themselves to thinking of human beings as a response to stimuli and looking for the causal relationship, so that their psychological work really bears very much on what we're trying to do in a religious realm. I think very often one could get greater insights from reading Abraham Maslow's Psychology of Being or Religions, Values, and Peak Experiences than reading some of the saccharine spiritual literature that's available that really doesn't probe the depths of the human situation. So these psychologists, to use them as an example of the general point I'm making, are really valuable people. I think of Carl Rogers' idea of telling us that part of the marks of maturity is to simply to be able to drink in reality, to not prejudge people when we deal with them, to not always use our own categories to filter through reality, but at times to be able to suspend judgment and to be able to drink in reality and to be open to what is going on. That particular insight would really help us, I think, in this quest for a deepened religious type self-awareness. I find a lot of help, too, in the sociologists in this regard. I think of Peter Berger's great works in The Sacred Canopy, for example, and The Rumor of Angels, that kind of thing, which alerts us to the way that society influences us. It alerts us to the ways in which our own outlook is determined or shaped by the culture in which we live. It helps us to achieve some sort of distance from that culture. One of our great problems, of course, in seeking religious self-awareness is that the culture sort of rules those questions out. The culture preforms our answers to those great questions. And what I get out of the sociological tradition is a critique of that culture, the negative side of it, of being able to stand back and try to distance myself a little bit from it and to realize my need to rise above the ordinary and the usual and the societally correct ways of analyzing who I am. I mean, if we took that approach, many of the great questions would be ruled out, like the great questions about death, for example, or talking about sexuality only in mechanical kinds of terms, the way the culture ordinarily puts it to us. So that I think that this humanistic sociological tradition as well is a great help in broadening out our understanding. So to put that in simple terms for people who don't read those kinds of books, I think it is simply a matter of saying, hey, where are there insights other than my own? How do they filter to me through the popular magazines or the talks I go to? Or is it possible for me to take some courses and learn some of the things about this? Or maybe I could read the simpler books about these kinds of approaches. But in general, what we're trying to say is that the insights into the great questions and to improving religious self-awareness is not simply to be found in my own tradition, my own religious background that I grew up in, but I've got to broaden out. I mean, that's what Pope John did for us. He reminded us, Christians, that we could learn from Marxists, for example. We could enter into dialogue with Marxists. Not that we're going to become Marxists, but we could learn something about their interest in social justice. We could learn some things about the future and how trying to create a better future for ourselves by listening to these people. Now, there's a fifth methodological point that I would try to make in all of this, and that is that this business of suspending judgment. I think what we're too prone to do is quickly jump in and to say that this is right or wrong, that these insights I'm receiving from other people are either correct or not correct, that my own ways of looking at things are always right, for example. Or the kind of problem that other people have is that they think that their own ways of looking at things are always inadequate, always poor, weaker. They always think that the other person has a better insight into what is going on. So I believe that we need to try to get over those kinds of judgments that are out of touch with reality. Very often that means suspending judgment for a while. What that would mean in personal terms is to be able to say, hey, I'm going to trust my own experience for a while. I'm going to see where my intuitions take me. I'm going to try to to look at life in my own way, make my contribution to my family life, to my personal relationships, to my job. I'm going to trust myself more for a while before I make this negative judgment, hey, I'm always wrong, or I'm inadequate, or I don't measure up. Give ourselves a chance. And I think, on the other hand, it could cut the other way and say, well, sometimes I have to just stop and say, I'm not always right. I can think of a husband and wife talking over a situation, and where the usual pattern is for one or both to always assume I'm correct and you're out of it, you're wrong, you don't really understand what's going on, or your methods are no good. I think that at times, if we could suspend that judgment and just try to see, well, how is the other person seeing it? First, try to understand what they're going through, see it from their viewpoint. And very often, I think that will not only improve the relationship and increase communication, but it will also enable us to deepen our own awareness of what is going on. So I offer this as another kind of method of achieving this deeper awareness that we're after here. That is, suspend judgment at some times. Don't quickly think that I've always got it right or correct, or that my own negative assessments of myself are on the mark. But stop and just understand. Let happen. Go with the flow for a while. Trust my own experience. See what's happening. Let go. Relax a little bit. And I think very often this is a way we have of deepening what is going on in our lives. Some people might be saying, well, that's still too general for me. How would I really get down to more specific ways of deepening this understanding? And let me suggest a 6-step schema here that I'm really borrowing from some of Michael Novak's ideas. And he suggests that we follow this sort of schema, 6 points. First, ask ourselves, what are the main experiences which have shaped our attitudes in life? For example, we could stop and think sometime, well, what 3 experiences, the biggest things that went on in my life, have determined who I am? What are the big moments that have decisively shaped my character? So a second thing would then be to ask ourselves, what images dominate our thinking about this? When I start to write it down or think about it, what images come to my mind? I could ask myself, what images of myself do I have as resulting from those experiences? Some people would say, well, I have an image of myself as a very successful businessman, or I have an image of myself as not measuring up in one way or another. Thirdly, what insights do you have into this matter? In other words, how do I then understand this? How am I going to get in touch with what is going on here? I might understand that, yes, I have this negative image and I shouldn't have it because it doesn't really match what is going on in my life. And now as a 4th point, I think what we would want to do is look at the development that we see in our attitudes and understandings about ourselves. We would try to be interested in seeing, for example, whether we've made progress in returning to our original example. If the person is feeling bad about themselves as a result of these experiences, they would have to see if they're seeing any progress in that at all. Do they find some development, and where would there be room for development into the future? And then as a 5th point, we might ask ourselves, what judgments can we make about the validity or coherence or truth or adequacy of our images and our insights, our understanding of who we are? In other words, our emotional reactions to things are not always correct ones. I think we live in a world where people want, well, if you feel that way, there's nothing you can do about it. But the fact of the matter is that very often our feelings are inadequate. They simply don't relate to reality. So some people come in and talk to me and say, well, I feel as though I'm unattractive, for example. And very often they are very attractive people. Very often they deal well with people. They make a nice appearance and so on. And yet their perception of who they are and what they're all about is out of whack. They're not in accord with reality. And I think that needs to be looked at. We need to make judgments. When I get angry, is that anger really appropriate or not? And if I think of myself that I can only be successful by making more money, is that an appropriate kind of image of myself or theory of success? And do I not need to, in some way or another, adjust it? And as a 6th point, I would try to say, what does my action or behavior tell me about who I am? In other words, very often we say actions speak louder than words. And I would have to see, do I behave in accord with my images of myself? Am I following out my best insights? And am I trying to live according to my judgments in life? So we've got a 6-step approach here, where someone could actually sit down and systematically try to figure out in a better way who they are. What experiences have shaped me? What images dominate that? What insights do I have into it? How has it developed over the years? And what judgments can I make about it? And what does my behavior tell me about who I really am? We're after this whole business of religious self-awareness. We're immersed in mystery all of our lives. We've got to get in deeper touch with that. That's how we become better people and able to function better in this world of ours.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210. This series of talks, Searching for Religious Self-Awareness, was recorded by St. Anthony Messenger Press. The speaker is Father James Basic.
In our search for religious self-awareness, we're constantly in danger of getting turned in on ourselves. We live in a culture which is really attuned to this business of self-fulfillment, of doing our own thing. We've lived through a decade that has been characterized as the me decade. And therefore, whenever we're involved in self-awareness exercises, we're always in danger of becoming sort of narrowed in on our own viewpoints and missing the larger world and so on. It's part of the reason for reminding ourselves that as human beings we're already related to other human beings, that we don't come to know who we are except by interacting with others, that at times it's important and necessary to reach out to others and to try to see the world in their way. Now, one of the ways that I think is very valuable in trying to both achieve a heightened awareness of who we are as religious creatures and also to avoid this excessive egotism is to think of the process as a matter of wrestling with the great questions, of trying to deal with the mysteries that exist in our lives, of trying to get outside of our own head and in a sense have an objective kind of question that we can deal with, a great matter that other people have wrestled with in the past so that they can throw enlightenment on it. So this idea, my theory is, and therefore of religious self-awareness, is that it involves dealing with these great religious questions and trying to objectively see how they have been posed by others and how we try to deal with them ourselves. Now I would like to deal with one of those questions, and I will term it this way, as is the question of what do I really believe? As we know, the problem of faith has become a large one in our culture today. Many people have rejected the traditional faith for a number of reasons. But in one way, I think the question that I'm posing here is even a deeper one, and that is that very often we are not even in touch at all with what we do believe. Many people are walking around not sure what creed is indeed motivating them in life. The problem comes, I think, in this way, that most of us grew up with a traditional creed. We grew up in a particular religious tradition. We received the teachings, the doctrines, the liturgies, the ways of that particular religion, and have taken upon ourselves that particular outlook and attitude. Now, as some people have gone along in life, they've begun to question those kinds of things. They begin to wonder if the creed really speaks to them anymore. When Christian people say the Apostles' Creed, does it really summarize what they feel and think about life? More and more human beings today, especially those involved in the self-awareness movement, are in tune with their own intuitions, their sort of gutsy response to what life is all about, their own sense of what is true and good and beautiful. And many people are now feeling that those things don't mesh anymore, that the received creed does not indeed express what their intuitions tell them, that the kind of doctrines they receive from their religious tradition don't seem anymore to summarize the best of their experience. The way they are taught in their church doesn't seem to correspond with what they feel is true about this world of ours. People, in other words, find themselves very often out of sync. Their religious convictions that have been given to them by their folks and by the tradition simply seem inadequate to express who they are now and the kinds of goals and motivations and values that are currently involved in their deepest inner life. Well, that's the kind of problem that I want to... It is the question, therefore, if people are saying, what is it that I really believe? What really motivates me? Is it this received creed, or is it some deeper intuition that I haven't really gotten in touch with? Therefore, I think very often it is a matter of trying to understand, first of all, what is it that makes me tick? What real faith is it that is moving me to act in a particular way in my life? Now, there's a man in the 20th century that who has really wrestled with this question in a deep way, and that is Pierre Teilhard de Chardin, the author of The Phenomenon of Man, The Divine Milieu, and many collections of essays. Teilhard was a man of science. He was a great paleontologist. He was one of the world's foremost experts on the geology of China. He was a traditional Catholic. He grew up in a Catholic family. He was educated as a Jesuit. And what he tried to do throughout his life as his major work was to reconcile his science and his religion. He was trying to get somehow into a proper sequence his sense of the earth, as he called it, this interest and passion that he had for understanding our origins, for his work in paleontology and geology, and to somehow make that serve his religious faith, to get those together. He was a son of the earth, as he said, but also a son of heaven. He had to figure out how to make those two things work. Now, in his little book, How I Believe, Teilhard describes that process, and I think it's very valuable for us to pass over to Teilhard's viewpoint, to try to see it the way he saw it for a while. Let him guide us in the process of uncovering our own faith and belief. Teilhard starts this way in this little paperback book, How I Believe, which is such an excellent summary of his thought. He begins with his sense of the earth. He begins with his intuitions that really have been shaped by his scientific background. And he begins by telling us that he believes in the world. And I want to quote that now. It's not real long, but it summarizes his own outlook on this. And he begins this way. He says, the world, its value, its infallibility, and its goodness, that, when all is said and done, is the first, the last, and the only thing in which I believe. It is by this faith that I live. In its most deeply buried form, faith in the world, as I experience it, is seen as a particularly live sense of universal relationships of interdependence. Everything holds together. I am led to the conclusion that man, in virtue of his very condition of being in the world, possesses a special sense which shows him in a more or less ill-defined way the whole of which he forms a part. This cosmic sense has degrees of liveliness and penetrative power that vary within the individual. Stage by stage, my faith in the world has taken a definite shape. What was at first a vague intuition of universal unity has become a rational and well-defined awareness of a presence. I know now that I belong to the world, and that I shall return to it, not simply in the ashes of my body, but in all the developed powers of my mind and heart. I can love the world. Now there we have a short statement of what I would call the faith of Teilhard de Chardin. You'll notice that in that statement there's no real talk of Jesus Christ or of the church which he dearly loved, no real direct talk about God, as a matter of fact. Now let me explain a little bit more of how Teilhard came to this kind of awareness. Teilhard, as a young child, I think he was about 5 years old, he remembers he was sitting by the fireside and his mother was cutting his hair. And when she cut his hair, a lock of that hair fell into the fire and burned up. It caused Teilhard tremendous anguish. His sense was that life is not permanent. Things burn up. We humans might burn up. All that we do and are has an impermanency about it. It challenges the worthwhileness of who we are and what we do. And in a sense, Teilhard's whole life, and this creedal statement I just read to you, was a response to that negative problem. That is, how can I keep things from perishing like that? How can I indeed assure a permanence for myself and my effort? When he was a young child, he used to keep pieces of iron because they had a permanency about them. And he had another terrible shock when they began to rust, because he felt again that things go out of existence, they decay. Now, this faith that he arrived at in this particular statement here is his way of overcoming that. In other words, he got, as a mature man, to the point of saying, no, the world can be trusted. He's saying to us that the world holds together, that it's moving in a particular direction, as a matter of fact, that it's moving towards a personal kind of fulfillment. You notice that interesting line he said at the end, I know now that I belong to the world and that I shall return to it, not simply in the ashes of my body, maybe a remembrance of this burning up of the hair, but in all the developed powers of my mind and heart. I can love the world. He could be passionate about his scientific activity. He knew that being a good paleontologist and geologist was a good thing to do. He arrived at the position that that was a worthwhile activity, that that activity was not indeed poured down in a drain to be lost forever, but was kept, was stored, was somehow brought to a greater fulfillment. He believed in spirit in the world, that the spirit was what counted, and that the Spirit was moving us all finally to a great union with the one who eventually he called his God as manifest in the risen Lord Jesus Christ. So here we have what I would call a faith. We'll call that Teilhard's faith. Faith in the world, in its evolutionary character, in its spiritual character, and in the fact that it was going to a final fulfillment. That's the way he describes it. Now, his real problem was to figure out how that related to his belief system. Because when he looked at his traditional Christian faith, it didn't seem like that, because he was taught in his family and in the seminary that the world wasn't all that important. He read Thomas à Kempis, who had said that when you venture out into the world, you return less a human being. He had read about the destruction of the world, that it would be burned up. He was given a whole feeling that maybe scientific endeavor was not really all that important, really. And so he felt, as he describes it and how I believe, that he had to reject that faith, that belief system that he had been given. He couldn't hold on to that traditional Christianity because it was out of sync with his deepest convictions about life. And therefore he tells the story of how he looked at the Eastern religions, and he saw some good things about them. He liked the way the Easterners had a sense of the wholeness of the world, the way it all hung together. But as he looked at it further, he found out they did not have a good sense of matter, the material physical world at all. For them it was Maya, or illusion, and he didn't want any part of that. He investigated some of the atheistic humanisms that were available to him. And he liked some of them because that had a good sense of building the earth, of creating a better society, of looking to the future and trying to shape it in some way. He liked that part of it. But it was also deficient because it didn't have any final kind of fulfillment for the world. The world was too self-contained, and he couldn't see how indeed it could meet his deepest desire that the whole world find a complete and total and ultimate final kind of fulfillment. And so he needed to reject those. And what did he do then? He returned to his original Christian faith, and he reread that tradition. He looked back at his Bible again, and he read especially the Apostle Paul. And when he read the Apostle Paul, he found there this talk of the universal Christ. In Romans 8, he read indeed that the whole world groans until it will share in the victory of the sons of God. And when he looked at Ephesians, the first chapter, and the first chapter of Colossians, he saw this grand vision of Jesus Christ being the center of the world, the universal risen Lord, in whom the whole of the world was bound together and would find its fulfillment. And when he discovered that, he said, terrific, eureka, this is it, I see it, this is what I've been looking for. My whole scientific vision is now corresponding with my religious convictions. The whole world is moving towards a final union with the universal Christ, with the risen Lord. And this was the solution of Teilhar's problem, putting together his science and his religion. His whole evolutionary sense of what the world was corresponded to what the Scriptures told us about a world that was in process of developing to its complete fulfillment and fullness in union with Jesus Christ. And in this way, he had put his faith in the world into a proper harmony with his belief system, his Christian faith, as he had received it. Now let's try to learn something from this story of Teilhard de Chardin. Let's try to pass over to his viewpoint and see what indeed we can learn about our own experience from what he went through, and how it would help us to work at this business of trying to get in touch with what we really believe and to try to reconcile our intuitive sense of life with the received tradition, with the creeds we have gotten from our religious heritage. Now, there's a three-step process that can be discerned, I think, in this whole thing that Teilhard went through. And it involves this. First of all, there is the negative sense of life, the problem that he went through in thinking that his hair burned up and that life was imperishable and nothing was worthwhile. Then he achieved what we will call a faith that overcame that negative sense, a faith in the world, its goodness, and its final fulfillment. And then as a third step, he reinterpreted his belief system, saw it in a new way, and somehow found in there a way of reconciling it with his deepest faith or intuition about life. Now that's a three-stage step. Now involved in that, there is a distinction between faith and belief that I think that we have to keep in mind. And that's sort of arbitrary in a way. It's used by Paul Tillich and Bernard Lonergan and Karl Rahner in one way or another. And that is, by faith, these people mean our intuitive sense of what life is all about. They indicate faith is our positive response in overcoming the negative things we experience in life. Our faith precedes, in a sense, any belief system that we have received. It doesn't necessarily have anything to do with Jesus or the church or God. It is more of our gutsy kind of sense, our primary or fundamental intuitions, as I like to call them, of what life is all about. And the word belief will try to restrict now to the acceptance of a particular religion. So that I would say, I believe in Jesus Christ. I believe in the teachings of the Catholic Church, for example. So belief has to do with the acceptance of a symbol system, of taking on an interpretive scheme that I've received from the larger culture or from the religious tradition in which I have been brought up. So we start out with that distinction between faith and belief to guide us. And it seems one way of talking about the problem of life is to say then, how can I get my faith and my belief into harmony? How can I try to live as an integrated and whole person so I'm at ease with myself, so that my received belief system is working for me, helping me to become a better person, guiding me in my decision-making, helping me to live a more fulfilled kind of life, helping me to serve others better, instead of somehow restricting me or making me feel too narrow or keeping me from doing the kinds of good things I want to do in life, the way many people end up experiencing it, that kind of conflict. Many people will tell you their belief, their religion seems to hold them down somehow, or more neutrally, it doesn't seem to foster their growth. That's the problem we're trying to overcome. Now, let's go back to those three steps, and I'll explain how I would take a group who was making a retreat on this topic, or how I would try to take people through this whole business. In the first step, I would try to get people in touch with their strongest negative feeling about life. That is, it would be an attempt to ask people, now, what do you see that's most wrong with the world? What do you most not like about yourself? What bothers you most about the human situation? What is your primary negative sense of things? Now, really, this could take on many different forms, I think. One would be the sense of the incompleteness of human existence, that it always seems like it doesn't work exactly right. We have these lofty dreams, and they're always smashed. People get married and have this dream of how it really ought to be and what it should be like, and it ends up failing in many kinds of ways. People long for an integrity, a wholeness in their life, and it really doesn't happen. So in one way or another, things are incomplete. They don't find their fulfillment. Perhaps another negative sense that some people would feel, and that is an abiding sense of personal unworthiness. So that some people are saying, I don't measure up, I'm always messing up somehow, I sin too much, I have a strong sense of guilt, no matter what I do it seems to work out badly, other people really don't like me, I don't do a good job. All of these kinds of expressions that I might put under the general heading of an abiding sense of unworthiness. There's something wrong with me. There's something inadequate. I know I always have a strong emotional reaction when people who I'm counseling will say that. They almost use those words. There's something wrong with me. There's something not right. I'm just not like other people. I don't measure up to other people's expectations of me. So, this would be a second kind of possibility, this abiding sense of unworthiness. Now perhaps that another example would be the sense of a lack of unity in the world, that things really don't cohere, that everyone's separate, like blacks and whites can't seem to get along, and Jews and Arabs have difficulties, and Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland are fighting. And people in the neighborhood, you'd like the neighborhood to be unified, but it really isn't. The person down the street, I have trouble getting along with those people, and we haven't talked for a while, and we don't seem to be on the same wavelength. It is the time when we look at marriages here in the United States, and we say, here these people are in love, they want to make it work, and yet things break down. The kind of unity that we long for, to be together with others and to be able to hold one another in the times of crisis and share great joys together, simply breaks down so much. So that some people have a sense of, boy, what a terrible thing it is that we're not united, that we're always fighting, that we got wars and religious persecutions going on, and neighbors not talking to one another, and families fighting. This would be this sense that the unity we desire we can't have, that there's an essential disharmony built into the world. And then there would be another example of a negative feeling, would be the sense that we're threatened in life, that by absurdity, that the irrational takes over. We might think of this in terms of the political prisoners in the world, or when we start to think of the Gulag, or the Holocaust, or Hiroshima and Nagasaki. All of those things bring out the absolute absurdity of things, the feeling that it's irrational. Why do men inflict this kind of pain on other human beings? It just seems so all wrong that we have an abiding sense of the absurdity of life. I think that maybe our modern writers have brought that to our mind, people like Sartre and Camus and Beckett through his plays. Many of the artists of our time have felt that kind of absurdity taking us over. Perhaps other people have felt that really the longings we have in life to know more and to love more are always frustrated. Some people are saying, boy, I'd just like to get a handle on this. I'd like to know more things. I have this drive to understand human existence, and yet it all seems so mysterious to me. I can't get a hold on it. And they feel a frustration about that. I think other people feel that in terms of their love. They would want to have more love in their life. They want to give more love. And yet they're always feeling the temptation to be selfish. And they'd like to receive more love. They'd like to have better human relationships where there was more love, and yet that seems to be frustrated all the time. Here we have another example of a primary, I think, negative feeling about life. So that list could go on, but what I try to do for people who are doing this retreat or this kind of workshop is to say, now stop and think, where is your own primary sense of evil in the world? What is your strongest negative impression about what is going on? Try to get in touch with that in your own life. Look how it was for Teilhard. His hair got burned up, and he was anxious that things were impermanent. That was his primary problem in life. Now we have to ask ourselves, what is our own? And to try to make this more personal, I guess I could say for myself, I would find that primary negative thing with the absurdity. I know what bothers me the most is this idea of the Holocaust, or of political prisoners being tortured right now. It just seems so patently absurd. The world can't make any sense like that. We got little babies starving to death right now. I have this really strong sense, I think, of the absurdity of life. And I find that that's what I have to end up dealing with. I know when the Holocaust is on television, I really couldn't watch it. When I belong to Amnesty International, when they send their material out, I send in my money, but I can't really read what they're telling us about these political prisoners because it bothers me so much. So that is my own way of sensing, I think, the negativity of life. But we would all have to get in touch with our own version of that. Now, as the second step in this process, then, what I would ask people to do is to think of ways in which they overcome their sense of negativity. Try to think now how you function anyway despite these strong negative feelings about life. So, we go back and we look at the people who feel that they have this abiding sense of unworthiness, to pick out one example. And we'd say, isn't there a way in which you keep going? Perhaps that you somehow feel or can find within yourself a sense that despite my guilt feelings, I still think that I could be all right. Or despite this abiding sense of unworthiness, I keep going and I function anyway. Or maybe down there in the bottom of all of that, I do have some feeling like, yes, I have dignity and worth. I'm a human being. I somehow count in this world. And I almost want to shout it out sometimes, even when I am feeling this abiding sense of unworthiness. That would be the person's faith, their ability to overcome this negative sense in life and to function anyway. We could take up any of the other examples. So the people who feel this separateness in life, this disharmony, perhaps there's times in which they sense, no, there's a deeper truth here. Despite all the wars, we humans really are on this spaceship Earth and we have a common destiny. No, despite the fact that religious groups are fighting one another, I believe there's a deeper truth that they really have a common bond that they simply haven't discovered yet. Despite the fact that I am trouble making my marriage work, that I believe that it could work, and I ought to keep trying to make it work, and that there's a love that exists deep down that we ought to be able to tap and to bring us into closer union. This is another example of faith that would try to overcome the negativities of life. Perhaps some people feel that this drive to understand life should be respected anyway. Even though I'll never know everything I want to know, I gotta keep trying to know what I can know. Even though I feel frustrated in making sense out of the mysteries of life, I must keep wrestling with those mysteries. That there's some things that I can understand. Even though life is finally incomprehensible, there are certain comprehensible and intelligible things that I can get a hold of. And I must be true to that drive to understand, even though I know it will never be complete and final. And other people will say that same thing about love. I don't have the kind of love I'm looking for in my life. I've never found the perfect lover or the ideal respondent. Yet I will keep trying to love more. And I will try to open myself and be more receptive so that other people can love me. This would be an example, again, of faith overcoming these negative senses that I am frustrated in my attempt to know more and to love more. And I think we could look at the absurdity question again and say, yes, there's a sense in which perhaps I believe that it has meaning despite the absurdity. Despite Auschwitz and the Gulag and Hiroshima, somehow the good is going to triumph in the world. And I know that's my own personal sense of it. When I try to think of my own sense of the absurdity of life, I feel this faith. I feel that it makes sense anyway. I find myself telling people who have seemingly insurmountable problems, hang in there, stick with it. And I don't feel that those are merely cliched phrases or something thrown out, because that really is in my guts. That's my intuitive sense of thing that we should hang in there anyway. We should put forth the human effort even when we feel frustrated. That somehow in the bigger picture all of that effort is collected, kept. It's worthwhile. Every effort I make to love and to be unselfish, to serve, to do for others, to learn more, somehow has value. Even somehow in God's great plan that is so mysterious, and we maybe should hardly talk about it, even the atrocities of our own time fit into a larger meaning system. That somehow good will triumph over all of that insane and absurd and irrational evil that we've come to know so strongly in our own 20th century. That's what I would call faith. It's my own faith. If someone asks me, what would I say, what is my own faith? I would say that despite the absurdity of life, I have faith that life makes sense, that there's an inner meaning, that there is a final integration of all of these things that threaten to pull apart in so many ways. And that's, now we pick that up from Teilhard again. You see, his faith was in the world, in its permanence, in its spiritual side, in the fact that it was evolving towards a personal power or presence that would pull it all together. I can't help thinking about the importance of those first experiences in life. You know, Teilhard got his hair burned up. I think it's Alfred Adler who has the idea that our first remembered experience is vitally important in our lives. And I stop and think back to my own first remembered experience. My family was building a house on the other side of the street from where we were living. And the foundation was laid, and the first floor was done, and the studding was up, and so on. But there were holes in the floor, big holes. And I was very little, I don't know how old, 3, 4, whatever. And my father took me over there. And we walked into the house, and I looked at those gaping holes in the floor. And that was frightening. You know, one could fall down into those holes, and it was black down there, and one could get lost somehow. And yet I had the feeling while I was holding my father's hand that I was safe. We walked along the flooring, and I wouldn't fall in those holes as long as my father was holding my hand. It was a very safe and secure feeling. And I can't help thinking that that represents something of where that faith comes from. You know, that faith is bound up with growing up in an atmosphere of trust. That it's tightly bound up with our relationship with our parents and so on. One of the clear things, although I think it's deeper than that, and that is, I think one of the things we end up saying about this faith that we have is that it is received as a gift. I've been talking now about that first remembered experience, and I think it would be interesting for people to just stop and say, what's my own first remembered experience, and does it help me in some way to get in touch with my primary negative sense of life, and also does it help me to understand what my faith might be? I would see it as simply a device that might work for getting us in touch with these deeper dimensions of our lives as we're trying to improve our religious self-awareness. But the point I'm trying to make now is that faith is felt as a gift. I don't have that faith coming, that sense that life makes sense despite its absurdity. I don't know where it came from. I didn't figure it out. Logically, it doesn't calculate. And yet, that's the way I feel in my heart. My deepest intuition is that way. And it seems to me, I could link it up with my father and say, because I had such a good father, I have this heightened sense of trust. And I suppose there's some truth in that. But it obviously goes beyond that. Many people who never had good family situations still have that kind of fundamental trust or faith. And I think when we stop and think about it in its deepest forms, about the only thing we can end up saying is, thank you. Thank you to some higher power, because we know we received it. We didn't earn it. We didn't make it our own. It came from a power outside of ourselves. And I think this is the thing that we would want to bring home in this second step as we try to understand our faith in a deeper way. Now that would allow us, I think, to move to the next and final step in this process, which is to deal with my belief system now. Remember what Teilhard did. He looked at his traditional belief system, and it didn't work for him. It was too negative. It was too anti-worldly. It was too spiritual, too heavenly to go along with his scientific mentality and interest. So he rejected that traditional understanding, but what he did was end up finding something in the tradition that indeed helped him to articulate the faith that was in his heart and that was his intuition about life. And I think that is what we would need to start to do now. That is, we would look at our Christian symbol system, look at our traditional creed that we've received. Now, some people, when they do that, will find, yes, that feels very good to me. That feels right. That really helps to collect what I feel is true in my heart. I know many people who function that way. The traditional way of understanding the faith, the doctrines they received when they were little, and the traditional church that they have known feels right, and it helps articulate what they hold to be true, and it is their guidance in life. And that's terrific. And they are peaceful people. They often interact well with others and can make a contribution in life. But the truth of the matter is that a lot of people, when they look at the tradition, are like Teilhard and say, it doesn't work. So some people will look at that and say, I feel that all the human race is one. We're all together. That's my primary sense. And yet I read in there and it makes it sound like God loves Jews more than Egyptians when I read the Exodus story. Or it makes it sound like there's an exclusive salvation for those who have said the name of Jesus and who are explicit Christians. And yet in my guts I don't think that's true. And when they feel like that, hear that, they say to themselves, I don't need that traditional faith. I don't want it. I won't have any part of it. I have to throw it away. And I think that's when people often quit going to church, when they throw away their traditional faith. Now, the other way of going about this, which I think is much more valuable, is to look at the tradition again as Teilhard did. Try to reinterpret it or refocus it. And here's where I see the great advantage of contemporary theology. Contemporary theology is trying to take those traditional doctrines and say them in a way that makes sense to people today. Trying to put them in, for example, into an evolutionary framework so that we understand them in the light of the way science has taught us to look at the world. Of trying to find a new language for them that really fits the way we Americans in our own culture would talk about life. This is the process of reinterpreting the particular doctrine. So someone could say, well, I'm not going to be a Christian because in there I was taught about hell, where people go and get burned up, and a place of fire and so on. And that doesn't make sense to me. I don't think there could be any such thing. And so maybe they end up hearing a reinterpretation of the doctrine of hell. And someone says, no, wait, hell doesn't just refer to a place of fire. Hell means that we are so free that we could turn in on ourselves and become so selfish that we could screen out God's love forever. In other words, that even God's love couldn't penetrate the armor of selfishness that we've put in His way. And we could have the frustration of living only with ourselves and not having God's love. And they might say, well, now that makes more sense. I could buy that. You know, if that's what hell means, yeah, that could happen. That would be an example of reinterpreting a doctrine and finding it more palatable. And one could say, yeah, that helps me understand myself, my own freedom, and my love instinct, and so on. Now, the other kind of thing I think that people would need to do is to refocus their belief system. That is more what Teilhard did. He went back and found things that people had forgotten. Not in his seminary, no one talked to him about the universal Christ, the risen Lord who made it all hold together. They didn't stress Colossians 1 and Ephesians 1 to him, but he found it in there when he reread it. And I think that's what's happening today for many people. Just to give you an example of that. Many people feel the need to be involved in social justice projects. They feel the great problem is to love your neighbor today in a way that's realistic, that takes account of the institutional and societal evils that we encounter. But when they read their Bible, at first it doesn't sound like that. Or they look back at their own tradition and they were taught, well, say your prayers, go to Mass, get to heaven, save your soul, and they think that doesn't make it. But when they go back and reread the Scriptures, what do they find? They find that the God of Exodus freed His people from political and social and economic enslavement, gave them new freedom and a new land. They find Jesus referring to Himself as the one who comes to liberate the captives. They find Paul talking about the love of neighbor as being of the essence of the Christian life. They find John talking about the fact that if we say we love God and hate our neighbor, we are liars. And when they refocus on that, they say, aha, this is good. I like this. This makes sense to me. All of that talk would give me more energy to try to help those who are in need. It would help me to become a better person truly in life. And they say, that I can buy into. I must say, one of the great joys in my own life is when I teach a contemporary theology class in my university setting, and I'm able to present contemporary ways of understanding all the great doctrines of God and Christ and the church and the sacraments and morality, and having people come up to me afterwards and say, well, if that's what it means, I can buy into it. Or I thought I was going to have to just throw off this Catholic heritage of mine, but the way you explain it makes sense, and I could really keep being a Catholic and live that out. That is, I think, a great experience in life. And it's, as I say, one of my joyful moments when I see that happening. Well, all I've tried to do is to take what the great theologians of our time have said and refocus it and reinterpret it so that it's out there for people so they can say, does that now correspond with my faith, with my deepest intuition of life, with my fundamental way of overcoming the negativities of life? Now, therefore, what I think we see there is the final step in the process. What we've done is to do what Teilhard did. Teilhard found the universal Christ, and that allowed him to remain a passionate scientist, to be caring about making the world better, and to stay being a good traditional Catholic as he had grown up, and now with a reinterpreted understanding of it. And I think that would help us, too, to discover what we really believe about this tradition that we have, so that it's in line with both our negative sense of life and about our positive ways of overcoming it. Now, I find that people in a retreat setting or in workshops often find this a valuable exercise, but it is also scary. It's difficult to look at the negative side of life. Very often that's almost more than we can take. It often takes a lot of effort to get in touch with our primary positive sense of things, because that's just part of us and it often escapes us. And this reinterpretation of the tradition takes some study at times, or some thought. So it's not an easy process, but I think it's one that's really well worth going through. Now, I think that it might be interesting as we look at this third step of the belief system to try to say a way in which I would try to summarize the Christian symbol system or belief system so that it would make sense for us in a modern way. And here, think back to my own story of the way that my own sense of absurdity and my own primary sense that the world has meaning. And I think you'll find that in the Creed. And here's the way I would say it. We Christians believe that despite appearances, life is good and can be trusted because it comes from a source that loves us. We believe that human existence has meaning because it has a goal where the absurdity that threatens us now will be overcome in the final victory of good over evil. We believe that it makes sense to speak words of praise and thanksgiving to this source and goal, and to address this one power as God, our Father. We believe that our Father's love for us and man's ability to respond to this love reached a never-to-be-surpassed high point in the historical figure, Jesus of Nazareth, who lived and died almost 2,000 years ago. The significance we attribute to Jesus is based on our belief that his death on the cross did not permanently end his life or influence, but that paradoxically, his obedient death has led to a new life and freed him to continue as the mediator of love and insight for all people everywhere, whether they realize it or not. This conquering of death, which we name resurrection, is the reason why we can trust life even when it seems so meaningless and unfair, since we believe that we and the whole world will one day share in the victory of Jesus, whom we call Lord, the Christ, and Son of God. When we encounter traces of the power of love released by the Lord in any of the activities of our daily lives, we believe that we are in the presence of a mystery. We experience these blessings, insights, and inspiration as a gift, and we believe it is proper to attribute them to the continuing presence of love, which we call the Holy Spirit. We believe that the one God, as source, model, and gift, continuously loves and calls all people everywhere. As Christians, our awareness of this activity is sharpened to our knowledge of Jesus, the Lord. Fortunately, his early followers who preached, taught, and celebrated his life, message, and meaning wrote down portions of this material. We call this collection the New Testament, and we expect to find inspiration and insight in this good news, especially in its central teaching of love of neighbor, which always includes love of God. We regularly gather to celebrate our Lord's life and death and to celebrate His continuing presence by sharing bread and wine as He did with His close friends the night before He died. We expect to find support and challenge in this public worship, which we variously call Mass, Eucharist, or Liturgy. Further, we realize that sharing this sacred meal is meant to prepare us for responsible service to our world and to sharpen our awareness of the Spirit who is at work always and everywhere. We never completely realize all the ideals of our faith. This is our sadness, but also our motive for continued effort. We realize that we must work to see that these beginnings grow, and we believe that the day will come when all of our valid longings for ourselves and our world will reach final fulfillment, and when, in the words of our sacred writings, God will be all in all. We've been wrestling with the great question of what we really believe, and we find ourselves immersed in a great mystery in life. We find ourselves trying to probe more deeply what it is we really feel, what our primary intuitions of life, and we find the need to relate that to a traditional faith, to a traditional belief system that we've received. When we're able to do that, we can then feel more integrated and live more effectively. What do I really believe puts me in touch with the deepest and most important questions in life and is a vital part of our search for a deepened religious self-awareness.
All rights to this talk are reserved by St. Anthony Messenger Press, 1615 Republic Street, Cincinnati, Ohio, 45210.